Good evening. I'd like to take a few minutes today to talk to you about Horace Mann and his philosophy. He was not so much an educational philosopher as he was a utilitarian and a transcendentalist. As a transcendentalist, he believed that if you could get a group of people thinking morally and about the right way for society to behave, that they could actually make changes to society and improve society for everyone. As a utilitarian, he believed that the common good should be served and that we should try to do the most good for the most people that we could. The utilitarians also believed that wealth was a gift from God, at least partially, and that those who were wealthy had a moral obligation to share that wealth, and it could be called upon to promote different endeavors that would help to improve the human condition. Horace Mann was a leader in many ways. He was a reformer who worked on abolishing slavery, prison reform, mental institution reform, ethical treatment of American Indians, and universal suffrage. Universal suffrage means the right to vote, but at the time you had to be a white landowner in order to vote, and that was not a very democratic principle, obviously. So he was working to try and make it so that you didn't have to be a landowner to start with, that you didn't have to be white, and then eventually that women would be able to vote as well. All things that we take for granted now, but they were fairly radical thoughts back then. They were not in tune with the way societies had generally been set up in the past. Reformer and a statesman were probably his biggest attributes. Education, he was best known for, but probably not what he would have said that he was primarily set to do. It was just one of the things he believed in. As a talented statesman, he was able to get a diverse group of people together to agree on a common concept of what common schools should look like. It was pretty easy to sell parents that their kids should be able to go to school for free, that their kids would have a better future employment and upward mobility because it wasn't costing the parents anything, and everybody wants better things for their kids. A little bit more difficult when you're teaching or trying to get business people to agree to higher taxes to pay for somebody else's kid to go to school. He did that by promoting several items. One was that the common schools would provide better workers who were more efficient or productive for business. So it would actually be in their own best interest to pay part of the money towards common schools. He also believed that students who taught or were taught by common schools would have a better understanding of moral values and that they would be willing to accept the property rights of others, which was also a good thing for the wealthy people of the day. So the biggest problem he had probably convincing people of what he wanted to do with common schooling was actually the educational leaders. At the time, many schools were run by the churches, and the churches got to, I would say, a bad way, but indoctrinate children into their own little idea of what Christianity or religion meant. In order to get a common school, man had to break down that idea and say, we can all teach children morals and ethical values that are somewhat religiously based, but they won't be affiliated with an individual church sect. What you ended up with was a kind of common Protestant moral that was taught in the early common schools. When I say Protestant, I say that on purpose because not too long after the common schools began, we started having an influx of Catholics into the country, which is a good thing. But that ended up with a little bit of a problem for the Catholics who were entering into a public school system which had a distinct Protestant feel to it, and also led to a lot of the work with Catholic schools because they were trying to keep their children away from a Protestant-based upbringing in the school system. Uh, Universal and fully integrated education was what Mann was preaching. That meant that everybody, regardless of sex, nationality, race, socioeconomic condition, was entitled to an education, and the integration meant that he wanted them all to learn in the same classroom. So regardless of who you were, he wanted you all sitting in the same classroom, learning the same subjects at the same time. He believed this was important because if you can get all the children together and teach them together and get them to interact with each other, they'll have a better understanding of each other and you'll have less conflict between the different groups. He saw it as being important that we maintain some kind of a common culture or common ideals that we could agree on as a people so that we could get along better and not have near the amount of stress and anxiety that we feel towards each other at times. Um, Mann also wanted to teach basic courses that included literacy, numeracy, science, math, history, geography, health, music, and art. And the school systems were to be supported by both the local and the state government and controlled primarily by the local government. Mann wanted to do away with rote memorization and recitation. He wanted to do away with corporal punishment. His belief was that you could better motivate students by having them interested in what they were learning than by psychological fear. Normal schools were the other big thing that Mann is known for. Normal schools were developed to teach teachers how to teach. That doesn't sound good, but that's what it was. It was a 2-year program that not only taught the subject matter that was going to be taught in the common schools, but also taught teachers different methods and philosophy on how children learn and how they could better help children to learn the material. The not, the normal schools also included demonstration schools, which are similar to what you have in many education programs today, where a teacher in training would go into a classroom, teach the class, and have a professional teacher monitoring them so that after the class was over, they could get feedback on what they'd done right and wrong, and the school could evaluate how well that prospective teacher was doing at being able to effectively train students. Many of the things that Horace Mann believed in and got built into the common school system still exist in the public school system of today. The curriculum is still very similar. The funding by both city and state is the same. Excuse me. And many of the techniques that he talked about for how to teach children have become much more popular today than they were at his time. So, doing away with corporal punishment, experiential learning, things like that, besides just rote memorization and recitation, are all things that Mann believed in and promoted. So, he has a very wide footprint on the modern public schools of today. Probably the most influential educator in the history of the United States. Up to date, and hard to imagine that anybody's going to surpass that since he was starting from scratch. So, if you have any comments, what I've done wrong, what I've done right, anything you agree with, disagree with, drop me a line on the discussion board. I'd be glad to answer back. Thank you.